said everything gonna be alright. I said everything's gonna be alright. Good day wherever you're listening from, and welcome to Indoor Air Quality Radio, IAQ Radio, for Friday, October 28th, 2016. This week is episode 435. My name is Radio Joe Hughes, and I'm coming to you from Studio D in Central City, Pennsylvania. At the controls is our engineer, John. You gotta have faith. And joining me from Studio C back in McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, is Cliff the Z-Man Zlotnick. Hello, Cliff.
Hi, Joe. Hi, John. Hi, Bill. Hi, everybody.
Great to hear you, Cliff. Good to be back in the saddle here with Bill Fisk coming on today. So, Bill, out of Lawrence Berkeley Labs in California, looking forward to a great show. One of the indoor air quality, one of the gurus out there in the indoor air quality world, looking forward to a great show with Bill. But before we do, we can't do the show without our sponsors. Let's thank our marquee sponsors.
John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at their website, jondon.com. That's jondon.com.
CleanFacts, the number one information source for cleaning and restoration professionals. Check them out at cleanfacts.com.
IAQ.net and Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions are available at IAQ.net. Please be sure to thank our sponsors for their support of IAQ Radio when you inquire about their services and products.
And last but not least, please visit the IAQ Training Institute website for the most current dates for the training you trust at IAQtraining.com. All right, let's turn it over to the Z-Man for today's IAQ Radio trivia question.
Thanks, Joe. Clinical prize by outcompeting fellow IAQ Radio listeners and being the first person to correctly answer the IAQ Radio trivia question each week. Submitting your answer is easy. Either email it to czlotnick@cs.com, or if you're listening to the show live, you can text in the answer via your computer. Congratulations to Steve Teams, Airways Environmental, Red Bank, New Jersey, for the first correct answer to last week's IAQ Radio trivia question. The IAQ Radio trivia question for Friday, October 28th, 2016, has been sponsored by Ideas, the solution chemistry company, creating unique solutions to odor removal, surface cleaning, and decontamination problems. Now for today's IAQ Radio trivia question. What is the atomic number of the element named after the Livermore lab? Back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Cliff. Today's guest is William Bill Fisk. He's a senior scientist and mechanical engineer and the leader of the Indoor Environment Group at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories. He's got more than 30 years of experience in research on the interrelated issues of building energy performance, ventilation, indoor environmental quality, and occupant health and performance. His research focuses primarily on energy-efficient methods of maintaining and improving ventilation and indoor environmental quality in commercial buildings, and on quantifying the impacts of building ventilation and IEQ on health and performance. He's a fellow of ASHRAE, a member of the Academy of Indoor Air Sciences, and he serves on the editorial board for the Indoor Air Journal. He's an author of approximately 100 refereed archival journal articles or book chapters, and his BS and MS degrees are in mechanical engineering. We've got some music for our guest.
So much freaking research. Looking through old books and old documents.
So much material out there.
Relevant.
That's relevant.
All right. Bill, do we have you on the line?
Yes, you do.
Great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Bill, we've talked in the past. The last time I saw you in person, we were at the EPA's PM 2.5 and Health conference they had at National Academy of Science in D.C. And at the time, I remember you were saying that you were kind of headed into semi-retirement, and we talked a little before the show. Maybe you could tell the listeners a little bit about what you're doing these days with Lawrence Berkeley Labs.
Yeah, so I did officially retire about a year ago, but I'm still pretty engaged in the research here at the laboratory. I'm working part-time, still writing papers and helping out with research projects and advising other folks. I do want to add one correction. In your intro bio, which was a little bit dated, you stated that I was the group leader, but when I retired, my colleague Brett Singer took over as group leader. So Brett Singer's now the Indoor Environment Group leader here at the laboratory.
Okay, great. And Brett has been on the show. He did a great job, and we hope to get him back again. It must be fun to work with these young, energetic, and really intelligent researchers that came into the Indoor Environment Group over the years. Where do you find these guys from? I mean, are they drawn to that area because the local universities there, and they work closely with the lab? How do you get these guys?
Yeah, we're really kind of lucky because I guess people love the Bay Area first of all, so they just love to live in the Bay Area. So that helps us attract really good people. A lot of our young people have come here as postdocs or graduate students and started here, and some of the strong ones continued with us over the years, and some of the others just were leaders in other areas, and as we got openings, we were able to recruit them and bring them in. But you're right, it's been a real privilege to work with such talented, creative people here. That's really what's made the work a pleasure.
Keeps you young too, huh?
Some of them, yes.
Somewhat. Now, how long has the Indoor Environment Group been the Indoor Environment Group?
Well, we've changed the names over the years, but we started an indoor environment research program in the late 1970s. It was founded by a chemist named Craig Hollowell, who was just a real pioneer in the field, but unfortunately died early. By 1980, we had a pretty substantial research program here with elements on building ventilation and VOCs and radon and combustion pollutants and exposure science and so forth. So Craig was really a visionary, I think, broadly in the field and really set us off on the right footing.
And the first government document that I recall that wasn't until '91. The indoor air quality, managing indoor air quality in buildings, was your group publishing things and putting them up on the website like they do today back in the '80s?
Well, we didn't have a web in
That's
the 80s.
True. Okay.
in the early 80s or late 70s. But yes, we were publishing documents in journals and publishing reports from that period in the late 70s.
Interesting, Bill. All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about the resource bank. I mean, how does the resource bank get its funding, and how does it choose the topics that that you're going to do work on?
Yeah. So, for the audience, the resource bank is a website which is sponsored by the EPA's Indoor Environments Division, and its focus is information on how indoor environmental factors affect human health and human performance, trying to be as quantitative as possible. And it has sort of various levels, short summaries, and then more detailed reviews of the literature. And then in each area it has sections on practical implications. It was originally the vision of David Madari, when he was with EPA's Indoor Environments Division, he developed a broad initial vision, and David and I developed sort of filled that out into an initial plan. But shortly after that, Greg Bruner with the Indoor Environments Division at EPA took over as the manager, and it's been Greg and I working together who've decided where to focus, in what areas to develop content. And I'd say that EPA not only supports the development of the website and the reviews that go into that, but also various projects to do critical analyses and meta-analyses, which are statistical analyses of published literature to pull together and to summarize what we know today.
And it's divided into groupings, I guess, and the first one I'd like to talk a little bit about, and I think it's really maybe one of the most important, is health and economic impacts of building ventilation. And it sounds like that was an early topic of interest, and I can imagine why. I mean, we had the first Arab oil embargo, which was back in, I guess, the late 70s, and we started tightening up a lot of buildings in the 80s and so on. Is that what led to the early interest in the health and economic impacts of building ventilation?
Well, I think the recognition that we had pollutants in buildings at levels that typically came from indoor sources that were at levels considerably higher than we had outdoors, coupled with the fact that we were making buildings more airtight, so we're having less outside air to sort of flush out those pollutants. That was an initial stimulus for indoor environment research. But the indoor environment field would be, fully relevant, still important for health, for humans, even if we had never changed ventilation rates in buildings, because the ventilation rates are just one of the set of key factors affecting our exposures and health effects indoors.
And with respect to that section of the website, when it comes to the health and economic impacts of ventilation, what's the most important takeaways in your mind we'll start with building owners and building managers. What do you wish they knew more about or understood better with respect to that topic?
Well, basically, I wish they understood more about the effects of ventilation on people, and sort of in summary, what we've learned is that in general, maybe not in every building, but in general, higher outdoor air ventilation rates are correlated with decreases in sick building syndrome symptoms and improvements in human performance. In schools, at least, there's considerable evidence that higher ventilation rates reduce absence rates of students. We can also show via models that there's a number of chronic health risks, for example, of cancer, that decrease with higher ventilation rates. And all these improvements with higher ventilation rates lead to some economic benefits. Now, there clearly are some energy costs of higher ventilation rates, and they vary with the climate. But in general, if you look at cost-benefit analyses, the benefits of those higher ventilation rates far outweigh the costs of higher ventilation rates. The other thing I think really needs attention is our classrooms, our public school elementary classrooms, because we have a broad set of data that indicates we have a very widespread problem of low ventilation rates in classrooms. That is, ventilation rates that on average are perhaps only 50% of the minimum rates that are specified in standards today. So we really need to focus on those classrooms.
And, I'm not sure I understand why that information doesn't seem to be getting through. I mean, with the emphasis on testing today and the fact that I think many schools are still paid, or they get, government subsidy based on attendance, why do you think that message hasn't gotten through a little more powerfully to the school districts out there?
I think school districts some of them understand the message, but the schools are really, they have extremely tight budgets. They don't have, highly qualified people managing buildings. A lot of the classrooms have natural ventilation. They're relying on openable windows, and they don't get opened. A lot of them have noisy HVAC systems, and they get turned off so that people can hear better in the classroom. And sometimes people are trying to save energy, and they reduce mechanical ventilation rates. So I think there's a number of reasons why we have this problem in classrooms. And we really need some systematic research to understand fully what those reasons are and to come up with the best solutions.
And I'm curious, you mentioned energy and energy retrofits and energy improvement, energy use improvements are, a hot topic again, just like it was back in the, the 80s and so on. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how these energy retrofits are affecting the indoor environmental quality in buildings, and what maybe we can do to make sure this time around, as we tighten up buildings, we don't cause problems with indoor environmental quality.
Yeah, very important topic. Energy retrofits can affect the indoor environment positively or negatively or both, and really depends on the retrofits that you implement and the context in which you implement them, so what the net effects are. And I think, our goal going forward is to use what we have learned to implement packages of measures, retrofit measures that simultaneously save energy, which is critically important, and to improve the indoor environment, or at least not to worsen the indoor environment, but ideally to improve it. And there's many retrofits that have no significant effects on the indoor environment. Retrofits that improve equipment efficiency. There's retrofits like addition of insulation and energy efficient windows that'll normally improve our thermal comfort conditions indoors. Those are important benefits. And then there's retrofits that decrease ventilation, such as envelope sealing, that increase the concentrations of pollutants that come from indoors, but they also decrease the concentrations of pollutants that come from the outdoor air. But the available evidence indicates that those reductions in ventilation rate will usually be more negative for health and performance than positive. So some retrofits can introduce pollutant sources, insulation materials, sealing materials. So we need to pay attention to that. Envelope retrofits, depending on how they're done, they can make buildings more prone to dampness problems or less prone to dampness problems, and we've learned a lot about how to make them less prone through our retrofits. So we apply the knowledge that we have today. I think we can clearly move forward, make our buildings more energy efficient, and maintain and improve the indoor environment. But it takes attention to what we know.
Cliff, let me make sure you get a chance to jump in here.
Okay. In your opinion, how has health-related effects related to dampness and mold changed over the years?
Well, I'm not sure that the health effects have changed over the years, the health effects of dampness and mold, but our understanding of the effects of dampness and mold and health has just grown enormously through research. And this is through really a big body of research from around the world, not a few limited studies, but many high-quality studies. And so we now have this extensive body of high-quality research documenting that dampness and mold is linked to adverse respiratory health effects, including asthma, and a significant body of research indicating that dampness and mold is linked to increases in respiratory infections as well. But we still have a lot to learn. We don't know for sure what the causative agents are. We know that when we have dampness and mold, we have more of these health effects, but we don't know for sure, is it molds or bacteria, or what specific molds or what bacteria, and that makes it harder to deal with the problem. But underlying the problem is the problem of dampness in buildings, so we need to do a better job of preventing those dampness problems and remediating problems when they occur, remediating them quickly when they occur.
Thanks.
Now, earlier you mentioned when we were talking about ventilation and then energy retrofits that done right, they can help with both energy and with dampness and of course with better ventilation. Give me some idea of the low-hanging fruit, that building owners and managers, the things they can implement that will help with those issues and that aren't going to be, an entire building retrofit.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mentioned a couple. Insulation of building envelopes and better windows can improve comfort conditions and probably prevent overheating, but not necessarily in every case, but reduce overheating problems too, which can be health risks. So those are very attractive. I don't know how much of our audience is familiar with the concept of an economizer, but an economizer is a control system in mechanical ventilation systems that brings in more than the minimum amount of outside air. When doing so, reduces cooling energy requirements. And economizers in commercial buildings will typically double the annual average ventilation rate, or more than double that annual average ventilation rate, and they save energy at the same time. And so economizers are a way to save energy, increase ventilation rates, and get some of the health benefits of better ventilation rates. Simple things like there's still gas stoves out there with pilot lights. Those pilot lights burn up natural gas, and they continuously release pollutants indoors. That's clearly the kind of thing that we should work on. And there's other options of that nature as well.
And I'm curious, Bill, with respect to ventilation, and then we're kind of combining ventilation and dampness at this point. Ventilation can be a double-edged sword, especially in certain parts of the country, whether it's because of particulate matter or whether it's because of moisture that comes in Miami, for instance, etc. How much is your group looking at the how there's kind of a trade-off between ventilation and filtration? How much are you looking at that? I know it's been a topic of discussion in the indoor air quality world. Should we be doing a better job of filtration? And if we do, can we cut back on ventilation?
Absolutely, we should be doing a better job of filtration. We specify in our standards for buildings very low efficiency filters, and we use low efficiency filters both in residential and commercial, and it's the benefit cost analyses indicate we'd be much better off using better filters in our buildings. And if we do that, we don't have to worry so much about increasing particle concentrations when we increase ventilation rates. I don't think there's a big trade-off, because the effects that we see associated with higher ventilation rates are things like changes in acute symptoms and absence and performance and so forth. And then the big health consequences of increasing ventilation, increasing particles from outdoors, are chronic health risks, including premature death and hospital admission and so forth, that are relatively rare but quite serious. And those are health effects that are well documented to be associated with the outdoor air particles. So there's sort of a different set of outcomes, health outcomes that these two parameters affect. So what we need to do is filter better and make sure we get adequate ventilation as well.
And I'm wondering if you have I saw some research that came out in the last couple of years about CO2, and since we're talking ventilation and other indoor air quality issues, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on CO2 as an indoor environmental contaminant as opposed to a surrogate for not having enough ventilation. What are your thoughts on that research?
Yeah. So to give the audience here a little background, for decades we thought that at the concentrations experienced indoors, CO2 was just a proxy for other pollutants that are associated with occupancy and a proxy for ventilation per person. But there's now been 4 studies where these are very controlled lab studies where we basically put groups of subjects in a controlled facility and during some periods just injected pure CO2 to see what the effects are. And so primarily looked at changes in performance outcomes. And there have been 4 studies. 3 of them have shown that adding CO2, but keeping those concentrations in the range that we see in some buildings, has some adverse effects on human performance. And one of them shows no effects, and one of the others just shows some relatively modest effects. So it looks like CO2 in particular is having effects on sort of high-level cognitive performance, difficult cognitive tasks, and perhaps less of an effect on simple cognitive tasks. There's a lot of questions remaining. Do these effects persist? These have been relatively short-term periods of exposure. They persist if you're exposed day after day. Do you accommodate to those problems? Do they get worse? So there's much more to learn still, but it's a very interesting area at this point.
I'm wondering, one of the things I've found, Bill, in my practice, I do some indoor air quality consulting, and even in my own home, is that during sleep, we get very elevated CO2 levels in many people's homes and even in my own. And I'm wondering, has there been any study on how that affects sleep and restfulness and how fresh you feel when you wake up? Are you aware of anything like that?
Yeah, there's a little tiny bit of research, but I'm not convinced of it. I mean, first of all, human cognitive performance is probably not that important while you're sleeping. So the immediate effects of CO2 and low ventilation is probably not important. But there is a bit of research out of Denmark suggesting that more ventilation at night could improve sleeping, for example. But I'm not convinced that they were able to isolate the effects of ventilation from noise of HVAC systems and noise of open windows. So I think we've got a lot to learn there. But certainly indoor environments in bedrooms while we're sleeping is one of the frontier areas for future research.
Okay, and what we've got to do at the moment is we're going to stop and thank our sponsors. We're going to take our halftime. We'll be back with the second half of our interview with Bill Fisk in about 90 seconds, so hang in there with us. And thanks to our association sponsors, the Indoor Air Quality Association, a nonprofit multidisciplinary organization dedicated to promoting the exchange of indoor environmental information through education and research. Visit them at IAQA.org.
The Restoration and Specialty Cleaners Association, who have been serving the needs of and advocating for their members for over 30 years. Remember, Triska is your link to industry training, certification, standards, and events. Their website is trsca.org. Thanks to our advertisers.
Gray Wolf Sensing Solutions, who use advanced sensor technology and embedded computers to provide superior environmental test instrumentation. Visit them at wolfsense.com.
Legends Environmental Insurance Services, the experts in insurance for environmental consultants and contractors for over 20 years. Visit them at legends-enviro.com.
And Particles Plus. They are engineers and manufacturers of feature-rich particle counters, air quality monitoring instrumentation, and vacuum pump technology. ParticlesPlus.com. Count on us.
And, of course, our marquee sponsors, John Don Products, where restoration and abatement contractors shop. Visit them at their website, jondon.com. That's jondon.com.
Clean Facts, the #1 information source for cleaning and restoration professionals. Check them out at cleanfactswithanx.com.
IAQ.net and Healthy Indoors Magazine, a free online digital magazine for industry professionals and consumers. Subscriptions are available at IAQ.net. Please be sure to thank our sponsors for their support of IAQ Radio when you inquire about their services and products.
Okay, we're back with the second half of our interview. We've got Bill Fisk on the line here, and it's been very interesting so far. Bill, I want to kind of summarize for viewers at this point, or listeners. We talked a little bit about the section of the website that goes over health and economic impacts of building ventilation, and then we talked a little bit about indoor dampness, biological contaminants, and health. And I'm trying to go down through the list of topics in the Indoor Environment Group website from the Lawrence Berkeley Labs. The next one I have on my list is indoor volatile organic compounds and health, and it seems to me that's a topic that, at least in the circles I run in, doesn't get as much focus as what I see in, when I talk to people from overseas. How big, can you give us a couple of thoughts on VOCs and their impact on indoor environmental quality, and whether you think maybe hasn't been focused on enough with respect to at least practice in the field in the United States?
Actually, my view is a little different. I think the public hasn't been highly focused on VOCs, but I think the architects, the interior designers, the suppliers of products for buildings have been focused on VOCs for quite a while, and they've really made some progress in reducing the sources in our buildings. So I think our building materials and our furnishings are smaller emitters of VOCs than they used to be. We've made less progress with consumer products and cleaning products, and of course people themselves are sources of VOCs. So we still have important sources of VOCs, but we've really made quite a bit of progress. And if you look at VOC levels in buildings today compared to a few decades ago, you can see the evidence of that progress. Countries like China, I think, may have a broader recognition because they haven't really dealt with the indoor sources as well as we have. So they tend to have higher levels. And because their outdoor air is often pretty polluted, increasing the ventilation is not a very attractive option for VOC control there. So they're in a bind. They really need to deal with the indoor sources, and of course they need to work with, air pollution control agencies and to try to deal with the outdoor air problems as well.
When we're on this topic, formaldehyde, of course, is a big topic of concern for people, and it's been in the news recently with the lumber liquidators. The thing on, I guess it was on 60 Minutes, and people have been a little concerned about their installed laminate flooring, and it goes back to the heart of what you're talking about. And I think that's a great point. We've done a pretty good job in the U.S., but we still import a lot of products, and they may or may not be as well manufactured and as well regulated, I guess, or monitored when they come over here. If someone had installed in your family, let's say, some laminate flooring from lumber liquidators that was concerned about the formaldehyde, what would your response be?
Yeah, I've gotten this question a lot. If you're concerned, simple things you can do are increase the ventilation, keep some windows cracked open, try to avoid periods of high temperature because emission rates of formaldehyde from materials increase strongly as the temperature goes up. High humidity also increases emission rates. Short of that, it's removing products, but I wouldn't do that without making some measurements, getting somebody to make some formaldehyde measurements, a consultant, to see whether they're really elevated in that particular space. At this time, I can't really recommend formaldehyde air cleaning techniques as practical. I don't think we have enough long-term information on air cleaner performance to say that there's products that I could recommend today.
Okay. And Cliff, do you have a follow-up on that?
Well, he actually answered my question, but Bill, do you have any experience with the adsorption material that utilized potassium permanganate for
Yes.
adsorption of formaldehyde?
Yes. I mean, it can, today it's mostly sodium permanganate. It can be very effective in reacting with, it's not a physical absorption, it's a chemical reaction with formaldehyde and removing formaldehyde. And the question is, how long does it last and how much does it cost? It's not specific to formaldehyde, so it removes, basically oxidizes a number of compounds, and it's pretty expensive. So I don't think it's a solution for broad use in home situations today.
Cliff, anything further?
No, that's it. The reason I asked is that I know formaldehyde has been used in different decontaminations with anthrax and other things in residences and public buildings and so on and so forth. And that they use formaldehyde to deal with it. And I knew that they'd used the potassium or the sodium permanganate. I'm not sure whether that's more recent or whether they had used the potassium stuff, but I know it removed it for, they got the levels down, after the projects and stuff, but other than that.
Yeah, that's, I'm not familiar with using formaldehyde to deal with contamination problems, but it's a different situation because you've got a temporary source of formaldehyde versus continuously emitting source that persists, say, for years in a building.
Right.
So, it calls for different types of solutions.
Thank you.
One of the other things I've seen is and it kind of came and then went back underground a little bit more, or it just wasn't as out in the public sphere as much, was these photocatalytic oxidation and titanium dioxide technologies, etc., and putting them maybe into mechanical systems. I'm sure you've done work on that, and I'm wondering if you could comment for listeners. Is that type of technology ready for prime time?
I don't think so. I think there's improvements. These are technologies that basically contain a photocatalyst, like it's a TiO2 photocatalyst, which is irradiated with ultraviolet light, and things like formaldehyde or certain organics adsorb on this catalyst. The UV light reacts, it produces reactive hydroxyl radicals, which can help destroy the formaldehyde. The problems that we've seen are that it doesn't necessarily break down VOCs down fully. So it may break them down partly. For example, a high molecular weight VOC might break down partially, and you have some formaldehyde as an end product or other organics as an end product. And sometimes those products of incomplete decomposition might be worse than the original ones for health. And the other problem is that catalysts have been susceptible to poisoning and short life. So making progress. I think we need more work in this area. It may be practical in the future, but I haven't seen a product that I can recommend today.
Okay, that's helpful. And then I'm curious with the section on the website on impacts of indoor environments on human performance and productivity. We've talked a little bit about that within some of the other sections. There is some overlap. Before I move on to the next segment, I'm wondering if you have any other comments on that section of the website.
I just think it's really important. I mean, the evidence is that the indoor environment can affect performance probably without any clear effects on health. And when we have indoor environmental effects of health, they also impose costs. And there's big economic consequences of changes in human performance. So that should factor into people's decision-making about how they design and maintain and operate our buildings.
You know, and I just want to let you know, I have used some of the documents from that section to try and get building owners to understand that, you know, some of these recommendations we make, like, you know, making sure you ventilate your building properly and others, it has some impact anyway. I'm not sure that it you know, changes their mind totally, but when they look at, they rarely see the fact that, you know, their costs are hard costs. It's, well, I'm paying more for energy and so on, and they don't always see that. So it's nice to have that information available for those of us out in the field to, you know, to hand it over to building owners. At least it gives us something beyond our own, you know, our word to them. So I find it helpful.
I also think, you know, in that realm, there's another sort of win-win, and that is with respect to temperature control. Temperatures pretty clearly affect human performance as well, with performance maximized sort of right around the comfort zone. And we have quite a bit of overheating in our buildings in the wintertime, which is an area where one can avoid that overheating. It makes some small but economically significant improvements in human performance and save some energy at the same time.
You know, and if we can get people to dress properly at certain times of the year too, I'm sure that's covered somewhere on the website, but, you know, having people wear the proper clothing in the winter versus the summertime, and, you know, long sleeves versus short sleeves and so on, there's some real easy things they can do that seem to be common sense, but it doesn't always happen in buildings. Where is that covered on your site, Bill?
Actually, we don't talk about different clothing levels on the website, but it's true. You know, using appropriate clothing, and, you know, there have been policies, for example, in some organizations and countries to, for example, not require men to wear, you know, suit coats and heavy clothes, you know, during the cooling season, and by doing so, you can raise the temperatures a little bit and maintain comfort. So clothing is important. And there's also, I think, some exciting developments in little personal control systems so at your workspace, where you can control your comfort locally better. And I think that's, you know, a path forward that can also allow us to have a little more flexibility in the temperature elsewhere in the building, improve comfort, improve performance. I'd look for those technologies in the future.
Okay, and let's move on to the next topic, and that's the benefits of improving indoor environmental quality. What does the research indicate are the most important benefits of improving indoor environmental quality? I think we've talked about, you know, a bit about them, a good bit about them so far today, but I guess, is there anything in that section that you'd really like to make sure listeners are aware of? I
mean, the key well-documented benefits are just increased satisfaction with the indoor environment, reductions in acute sick building symptoms and allergies and asthma, decreases in absence, and improvements in performance at work and performance in schools. I think those are all really important benefits.
And the next section that I want to talk about is the air cleaning effects on health and perceived air quality. You were talking at the PM 2.5 conference, and you spoke a good bit about filtration, and I thought some of what you said was very interesting, and I may be mixing up conferences and presentations, but I think you were talking a little bit about some of the newer filtration and the electrostatic properties of some of these newer filtration products. I wonder if you could tell listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, I didn't really talk a lot about that at the meeting, but one of the topics you may be referring to is the performance of different types of particle filters. We have filters that have embedded charges in them to help improve performance of removing small particles, and those embedded charges help, but sometimes those improvements in particle removal of that type of filter decays, and it depends on the kinds of particles that are deposited on the filter. So if you have, say oily particles or something depositing on the filter versus just black carbon particles on the filter, you can see that the performance of the filter actually decreases after a while. So another change is happening in filter technologies. There's just more of a move to highly pleated filters with small fibers and maybe gradients in the types of fibers in the media that allows us to get a efficient filter that's not deep. It may still only be 1 inch, and it doesn't have a high pressure drop, but it has a lot of media. So I think these improvements in filters make using better filters much easier to accommodate, more practical today.
And when it comes to filters for the typical listener out there, what's the most important thing with respect to ensuring that the filters are doing what they're supposed to do? Is it is the bypass the key? Is it going to a thicker filter with more pleated type filters? And maybe you could give a little tip on that.
Yeah, bypass can be important, but really the most important thing is to pick a relatively efficient filter to start with and to change it when it needs to be changed. And make sure that filter doesn't impose a particularly high pressure drop, which means it needs to have a lot of pleating or a large surface area. And it's pretty simple. The technologies are very well developed and can be very effective. And the evidence is that better filtration can reduce these adverse health effects that are very clearly documented to be associated with higher outdoor particle levels.
And while we're talking about, I'm sorry, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just want to say that the costs are really pretty modest compared to the benefits.
And while we're on filtration, I was wondering if you could give listeners a few tips based on your research on portable air cleaners and how effective they are in the first place, and then if you're going to recommend a portable air cleaner, what's important to keep in mind when making those recommendations? Yeah.
So portable air cleaners can be quite effective in reducing indoor particle concentrations. Most of the research is in homes. There's been a lot of high-quality studies that does appear to be only small, improvements in allergy and asthma health outcomes with portable air cleaners. We don't fully know why, but those small improvements, and they're primarily linked to places where we have strong allergen sources. So again, if the benefits are those associated with the health effects of outdoor air particles. Portable air cleaners can remove particles more energy efficiently than central systems because they use high efficiency filters. So if you have a central system with a low efficiency filter, you're pushing a lot of air through it and through all the ducts and not getting the benefit of removing the majority of the particles in the air. But the portable air cleaners that typically use HEPA filters remove most of the particles, and some of them have very efficient fan motor systems as well. So they can be pretty energy efficient. So what are the tips? I mean, pay attention to the clean air delivery rate. You have to have enough particle removal to affect particle concentrations. Pay attention to life cycle costs, not just initial costs. Over time, the filter replacement costs and the energy costs are a really big factor. And pay attention to noise, because a lot of the devices are too noisy and people turn them off. So those are I think, the key factors for practice.
And go ahead, Cliff. You got a follow-up?
Yeah, Bill. I would say in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a big movement, I think, in the disaster restoration industry towards the use of hydroxyl generating equipment for odor removal, for particulate removal. Yeah. You know, I think these devices are often sold as the silver bullet for, resolving all the problems. And I think the listeners are confused about a couple of things. One of the things, do the hydroxyl radicals actually get outside of the equipment? And if so, how far can they move before they break down, in the environment, or does the entire reaction occur within the device?
Yeah. So, first of all, there's a lot of air cleaners that intentionally emit ozone, but you can also emit other chemically reactive molecules, perhaps including hydroxyl radicals. Reactions could occur in the device, or they could emit chemically active molecules into the indoor air. I think it's important to avoid air cleaners that emit reactive compounds into the indoor air, because we don't break down chemicals completely, so we get undesirable byproducts, or we have a risk of that. So I think that should be avoided. It should be one of your first priorities in selecting an air cleaner. And as far as sort of the performance of many of these devices, they haven't been well studied. So there's much that we have yet to learn.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, another section, and the last I want to mention on the website is climate change, indoor environmental quality, and health. And obviously there's been a great interest in that area lately. What are your thoughts on how much effect climate change is going to have or is having on indoor environmental quality?
Yeah. Of course, we can only make predictions about the future because most of the climate change is yet to hit us. But it looks like there's going to be some substantial effects unless we implement corrective measures. And areas that I'm concerned about are overheating indoors when we have periods of high indoor temperatures, particularly in buildings without air conditioning or where people can't afford to operate their air conditioning, and with effects as minor as increased thermal discomfort to, increased premature death. But a lot of people die during heat waves or can die during heat waves. So I'm quite concerned about that increasing with climate change. When it gets warmer outdoors, we have more chemical reactions that produce ozone in the outdoor air in urban areas, and that means we're going to bring more ozone into our buildings. So that's a concern as well. If we do a good job of reducing the pollutants that lead to ozone production, that won't be as big of a problem. With climate change, we project more severe storms and sea level rise, and we'd expect that to lead to more dampness problems and mold problems in our buildings. We're already seeing big increases in wildfires, particularly in the western United States. And there's adverse health effects of wildfires, and they come substantially from indoor exposures during those wildfires. So particle exposure during wildfires being more common with climate change is a concern. And then the last area is building energy efficiency, and we talked about that before. Depending on, we need to make our buildings much more efficient to help reduce climate change, but how we do that is going to determine whether we have positive or negative overall effects on the indoor environment.
Okay, now I've got some general questions that I'd like to finish up with here, Bill, and these are kind of, the ones that we ask a lot of the people that come on the show that have been in this industry for a long time, and we respect their opinions. So I'm curious, what type of emerging IEQ issues do you see that maybe we haven't talked about? I know some of these things we've already talked about, but maybe you could recap those. What are going to be the important issues in the future?
Yeah, there's a lot of areas. I mean, we talked about the direct effects of CO2 on human cognitive performance. Clearly, that's an emerging important issue. I'd say the health consequences of indoor exposures to semi-volatile organic compounds that act like hormones in humans, some of the flame retardants and plasticizers, so learning about what are the effects, reproductive effects or cancer effects or other effects of VOCs. Certainly an emerging issue, needs more attention. And I think a really interesting one is the interaction of what we call the human microbiome, the complicated mixture of bacteria in our body and the microbiome in buildings and the implications for human health. Because we're learning that, people have, and their health is very much affected by all these microorganisms in our bodies, and the indoor environments may affect those microorganisms, and there's potentially profound effects for health. So that's a really exciting area for the future.
I'm wondering, I've seen people recently advertising probiotics for buildings, and I'm wondering, I have my thoughts on that, but I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? Is that ready for prime time?
I certainly haven't seen any evidence that it's ready for prime time.
Okay, I appreciate that. Next one is, you've dealt with indoor environmental quality and energy-related research over the years, ventilation. What are the most important tips, I think, that you would give to indoor environmental quality investigators, people out there trying to solve problems for people in buildings?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these investigators are very, very talented, and what I say won't be news to them, but certainly they need to employ a portfolio of investigative methods, including talking to people in the buildings. And I think they need to avoid excessive reliance on expensive indoor air quality measurements. For example, levels of airborne mold haven't been very predictive of health, so they don't really add a lot of value, but they can be expensive. But I'd also say be wary of snapshots, because the building operation and the indoor environmental conditions can vary a lot over time, and I think there's perhaps too much reliance on a very short snapshot of indoor environmental conditions without paying attention to the potential variability over time.
I'm glad I asked, because that's I wasn't sure what kind of answer we would get, and those are very important. I think I have to agree wholeheartedly, and I'm glad we asked. Let's do the same thing for remediation. I guess I want to start with this. I have a hard time sometimes finding good information on the effectiveness of remediation techniques in indoor environments, whether it's cleaning up after there's water damage, or cleaning up after fires, or removing odors, etc. Can you talk a little bit about that, and then any tips you may have for people that are doing remediation?
Yeah, you've identified a really important issue, and that is we have a lot of remediation, but there hasn't been a lot of follow-up to see how effective it is. and the market doesn't necessarily support that. So I think ideally the remediation needs to take advantage of every opportunity to evaluate whether their remediation efforts really work, so they learn from experience, and we need to communicate what they've learned. And we just don't have enough data. We do have a little bit of research on effectiveness of moisture and mold remediation in buildings, but it's a very small number of studies. It does look positive, but many of the other remediations, we don't have a body of literature to determine whether they're really effective or not.
And Cliff, before we sign off, I want to make sure you've got a chance to get any final questions in.
No, I already did. Thanks, Joe.
I'm wondering, too, before we go, Bill, any final thoughts for those that are building owners and managers out there? And we've talked a little bit about that during the last hour, but any final thoughts on what's important for them with respect to maybe some tips?
Sort of, following what we said, when they make their decisions about building design, operation, maintenance, pay attention to the possible effects on occupants' health and performance and their economic significance, because just not given enough thought today.
And especially up front. I'd love to see more building owners and managers, designers work with indoor air quality people up front as opposed to bringing us in only when there's a problem at the end. Finally, before we go, we always like to ask the last question is there anything we missed that you'd like to add? Any final thoughts? And I also want to just thank you so much for joining us. We've been hoping we could get you on here, and I'm glad we did.
Yeah. I just wanted to thank you and your team for the opportunity to speak here, and thank EPA. They've been a longtime supporter of the work underlying this website, and it's really been a great working relationship. So I really appreciate the EPA support. Thank you.
Okay, and this is Radio Joe Hughes saying thanks so much to this week's guest. I'm so glad we were able to finally get this one worked out. I had a mix-up on the dates the last time. I had too many things going on at once, Cliff. But Cliff, any final comments? Thanks again to you as always.
No, it was a great interview. I have a tired hand, but it'll be a good blog.
Writing the blog, and Bill, we'll pass that blog along to you for any comments prior to putting it out before next week. And Cliff, are we set for next week now? Are we going to have the show we discussed?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, so I think we're going to have Pete Consigli and is Ken Larson joining us?
Correct. We're going to talk about the state. We're going to continue our discussion that we had with Jim Pemberton and Lisa Wagner on the state of education in the industry, get their opinion on it and how to make it better.
Well, until then, this is Radio Joe Hughes saying thanks to this week's guest, Bill Fisk, to my co-host, the Z-Man, Cliff Zlotnick, to our engineer, John, you gotta have faith, most importantly, to our growing group of loyal listeners. Please come back and join us next Friday. We'll be live again at noon with the next episode of IAQ Radio.
This has been another IAQ Radio production.